North America might be lagging Europe in terms of the number of projects and the manufacturing base. But what North America is very good at is its adoption to changing technology and changing behaviour as to where we build our buildings, for sure.
Put that coffee down.
Creators are leaders. Be careful what kind of leaders you're producing here.
Helen, we're both in sales. Let me tell you why I suck as a salesman.
They realized that to be in power, you didn't need guns or money or even numbers. You just needed the will to do what the other guy wouldn't.
I'm not leaving. The show goes on.
Well, hello there, friend. Welcome to the Construction Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Bradley Hartman. I'm excited to bring to you today my conversation with Mr. Nick Milestone. And for someone in the construction industry, talk about an incredible last name, Milestone. It's perfect. Nick Milestone is the director of Mercer Mass Timber, and that's what we're talking about here today, the trends, the opportunities, and the challenges facing the mass timber construction industry. As you will hear momentarily, Nick Milestone is English. He's from England. If you were to leave London and then kind of go northwest up to Birmingham, pretty sure they pronounce it Birmingham, and then continue north to Sheffield, and then go to Leeds, and then hang a Ralph, you then hit a town called Hull, Hull, Hull in the UK, England. That is where Nick is from. He got his education. He's got a whole batch of degrees. He's got like 7 or 8, I don't know, from Leeds Beckett University, and he has worked throughout the industry. He grew up, he's going to tell a story about learning about carpentry from his grandfather. Then he got into the construction industry largely with steel construction before coming back and finding his passion, his life's work with mass timber. He is now based in British Columbia, in Vancouver, as he works for Mercer Mass Timber. We talk a little bit about the history of mass timber. We absolutely talk about the future of mass timber. We talk about glulam and CLT. We talk about kind of this little technology sandwich where you got BIM, building information modeling. We also have offsite construction. That's the bread. And in the middle is mass timber. And we talk about the importance of listening to the market and never forgetting the fundamentals of economics to make sure we are building these on time, under budget, and profitably to help these owners realize profit sooner for their construction projects. We talk about all of this and more. I really enjoyed talking to Nick, and I learned a ton just about mass timber, and I'm really excited to see where this trend goes from here in North America. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Mr. Nick Milestone, director at Mass Timber. As always, thank you for listening. So, Mr. Nick Milestone, welcome to the show.
Hey, good morning, Bradley.
I'm excited you made time here, and it couldn't be better. Just last week, I was in San Diego and at the West Coast LBM Association, and Dr. Shi-Ling Pei from the Colorado School of Mines did a presentation and had some video that blew my mind on a 10-story mass timber building that they built and were subjecting it to all sorts of these 80 different earthquakes that have happened over the years. And it was, no one in the audience was speaking. All their jaws were on the floor. And I was thinking this is perfect segue because I'm talking to Nick next week. So I'm really excited to talk to you about mass timber here.
Brilliant. Perfect timing. Absolutely.
Yeah. So if we can, take us in the way back machine, Nick. You're 12 years old, okay? You're 12 years old. Maybe give us a little context of where you are geographically, and maybe give us a little understanding of your family. And what was 12-year-old Nick Milestone? What were you into? What were you passionate about?
Gosh, 12 years of age, probably video games.
Okay.
I think an Atari springs to mind.
Okay.
If anybody can figure out that far back, gosh. So I originate from a city in the north of England called Hull, which is up in the northeast. Nothing special. It's a city that's, sits on the end of the freeway And yeah, life with me was mum, dad, grandparents. I had a great connection with my granddad, which probably is where I started the journey I'm on now. He was a carpenter.
Hmm.
He was an accomplished joiner. He was a skilled tradesman. And he was a huge influence on my life. He got me into soccer teams, followed the local team, Hull, which, has graced the Premier League, I'm proud to say. But he also got me into construction because I used to go with him on the odd Saturday just to understand what he did. And I was just fascinated where, he was a proper guy on the tools and he was just proud of his own achievements. And when he passed away in 1995, the sad part of his life was all was left was just a bag of tools. He'd left no legacy. He'd left nothing. And that skill set had not translated onto the next generations, including myself. And he and I were incredibly close. And he got me my first job. He got me into the same construction firm he was working at when I was 16. Because in the UK, you can work, then you could work from the age of 16. So I kind of combined my studies and working. But he was determined I wouldn't be out on the job site. He was determined I'd be in the office. So I took on a great role of being what we call in the UK quantity surveyor, contract administrator.
Okay.
And great fun, went to college, learned construction. And then in the, late 80s, early 90s, he was a little upset with me because I decided I want to see a bit more of the world. And I didn't go too far. I went 30 miles north. And I ended up working for a huge steel manufacturing and construction business who were quite global, and that was the appetite. And then next thing you know, I'm not just the parochial little kid. I'm now working sort of UK-wide on all these major projects. And he was upset with me for leaving kind of the timber world, the joinery world, for the steel world. And I spent 8 years working my career from being that quantity surveyor. I transferred to project management, contracts management, construction management. And on that path, I sort of self-educated. I got myself 3 university degrees, 2 bachelors in construction economics, in project management, and then I mastered in project and commercial management. So I felt I needed to educate myself. And then I think I got to the age, at that point, yes, must not forget, I got married and had children on that life journey. And then when I got to about 34, I moved down to the Midlands in the UK. Near a city called Derby, near Nottingham. I'm sure everybody's familiar with Nottingham, not far from Nottingham. And I worked for a general contractor, and they had a specialist steel company. And so I kind of got myself elevated to a board position at quite a young age of 34. But I was incredibly passionate about project management, commercial management, construction, and blink of an eye before you know it, I'm the managing director. And this is where it tests you as a human being about being a leader. I mean, anybody can be a leader when times are really good and the world's buoyant. It's when times are tough, you have to think on your feet, you have to restructure, rationalize your business. And prior to the financial crisis, when we were putting up steel structures for key clients, especially in the retail world, like as the Walmart, as they once were, and Tesco's. And I was approached by Tesco's in 2006, so 2 years pre-crash. And they said, we're going down a more sustainable route of construction, low carbon construction. Well, we're going to get away from steel buildings. We're going to go into what we believe is mass timber and glulam. And I said, well, I know of glulam, quite an expensive commodity, not really a product in the UK, more sort of coming from Europe. And I said, okay, I'd like to be part of that journey. We've got such a great relationship. Let's see if we can transfer our skill sets of the whole DFMA, design, manufacture and assembly, which is the offsite world. And we're now really sort of heavy into this BIM orientated environment of VDC, virtual design and construction, BIM being building information modeling. So effectively everything's been transferred into a digital platform and we got into the world of 3D modeling. So I went on this journey and then this thing called the financial crisis hit, which meant I had to, practically shut a steel business because the market was saturated.
Yeah, I wonder if I can jump in here real quick. So when this opportunity, kind of a client approaches you and says, hey, more sustainability, glulam timber, what attracted you to it? Did you realize how big of a trend this would be?
No.
Because you didn't. Okay. Because I mean, on one hand, it's almost, you kind of grew up in the carpentry world, lots of wood, lots of detail with, your grandfather. Then you go to the opposite side, none of that, kind of real steel. And now it's like, okay, and kind of where we'll get to in the future is we're going to be marrying these two up here. But what attracted you to kind of this opportunity to get away from really what you had known and what you'd been successful building over the previous, whatever, decade?
Yeah, you know what? I was invited to a job site where one of the retailers was already building in mass timber. And it just so happened to be with our parent company, the general contractor who owned the business I was running. I was invited up saying, Nick, we heard you talking at your board meetings about mass timber and Tesco's. We're building this job and it's not going very well. Come and give us some advice. Can you translate your steel skill set?
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to the job site. And do you know what? I remember it's still vivid in my mind now, driving up to the job site and seeing this glue lamp structure. And I was just overwhelmed. I was overwhelmed by its beauty, its character. I got to the job site, the smell of wood. This is not like a steel fabrication shop where you can smell the iron fiber in the air.
Very different.
It was vastly different. And the first thing I did when I got to the job site was wanting to touch the glue lamp columns because it was, and I didn't realize at the time, that's actually biophilia. That's our human connection with nature. And that is what I realized. I want to do this. And so I got really deep into the weeds, into the detail. And what I found was absolutely nothing different to the steel world. Mm-hmm. It was identical. It was the same processes, just being very poorly executed at the time. And I said, look, I'm watching these beams going up in the air. You're taking them down again. You're having to cut holes and slots. This is prefabrication. We do this in the steel world all day long.
Right.
It goes to site with zero waste as a prefabricated component. Anyway, so I ventured on a journey. I spent the entire of 2007, the summer, 7 weeks. And I went through every country from Slovenia up to Sweden. And I went through Austria, Germany, France. I went through all the European countries, really to find the supply chain, which is what I went for. And basically then aligned myself with two beautiful companies, one in Austria and one in the north of Germany, in Dusseldorf. And we did it. We then started bidding projects with these guys. Who would do what? We drew lines in the sand in terms of scope of work, who would do the manufacturing drawings, who would do the coordination. So we kind of figured out who would do all the connection parts, because glue lam is still heavily reliant on structural steel in terms of connections. And so we really sort of put a lot of effort into it. And then come the beginning of 2008, in January, we landed our first project on site. And guess what? It fit perfectly. And our client said, thank you. You've kind of answered all the challenges by sorting out the puzzle of the process. And we never looked back as B&K Structures. We survived the financial crisis. We ended up building 35 major supermarkets, hypermarkets across the UK for a variety of clients. And then we started to looking at other buildings. We started to do geodesic domes, swimming pools, subtropical swimming paradise. We started doing schools. We started a product that it was directly related from what is in the structures market to the timber structures market. And then a second event happened around 2010, 2011. We heard of this thing called CLT. Mm-hmm. We thought, well, what's CLT? Cross-laminated timber. And we went out, we had a look, and hang on a second, the Austrians have been building for this since the early 2000s in the housing market. So I got some really clever engineers I employed and said, right, guys, can we make structure out of CLT? And then we found, wow, we had just replaced metal deck and concrete on steel structures with CLT floor plates. We can do load-bearing walls. And next thing you know, we're building Dalston Lane, which is a 9-story, 9/2 in London with Andrew Waugh. And we just went on this miraculous journey. And at that time, the steel business was declining. The timber business was on the take, was on the up.
I want to jump in here just real quick. And I want to hit maybe kind of tying into CLT. And then I want to circle back to one thing. I think some folks here are probably passionate, but not nearly as knowledgeable as you, Nick, on this. Do you have a concise definition when we talk about mass timber, what mass timber is and what it isn't, just to get that definition out of the way?
Yeah, it's defined as two components. You're dealing with glulam, which effectively is columns and beams. There's a primary structural frame. And then you've got CLT cross-laminated timber, which is effectively big slabs, big billets of wood, which can form floors and walls. So when I look at a building or a building typology, so I know if it's like an office building or it's a residential building, straight away I'll know what the structural frame system needs to be.
Okay.
I'm not a structural engineer, but I've built enough buildings in my career, nearly 600 now, across the world. And, straight away I'll know, when I look at the spans, I know exactly what's required. And I know what kind of buildings. And equally at the same time, what's affordable, because cost is king.
Yes.
And cost v carbon is the biggest trade-off. And when you're in a market like the UK where wood is not a natural resource, neither is the manufacturing of glulam and CLT, and it's very much imported from Europe, you then got to look at the context of your own market. And, the UK is very much a predominant concrete and steel framed structures market. How do you then bring mass timber into a market without affecting cost? And so this is what we set ourselves up as a business model, as a hybrid model.
Okay.
So it was very much based on, you can have a glulam frame. We can save a lot of money and go for a steel frame, but let's eliminate the deck and concrete and use CLT as the floor plates.
Okay.
And therefore you're eliminating a lot of high carbon intensive material like concrete for substituting. And the mass in any building is the floors. You look at the footprint of a building, the floor is where the mass is. And if you can substitute that mass with CLT. And it became a really good business model. And the residential market was great. The UK's building regulations at the time were very not prescriptive. It was more based on design-built solutions where we did the calculations. And it was just a wonderful journey. And that got me then being involved with trade associations in the UK, like the Structural Timber Association. A very old established one was called TRADA, the Timber Research and Development Association. And they've been kicking around since 1932. Wow. And so I was invited to sit on their committees, asking me because everybody was looking at mass timber thinking, wow, this is really pioneering. What can TRADA do to support this? So I said, we need to do many things. There's a national specification for steel. There's a national specification for concrete. There isn't one that governs timber, especially mass timber. So we set about on a 2.5-year journey, and I chaired the National Structural Timber Specification. I did it, to capture so much knowledge in one document, whether it's tolerances in design, manufacture or install, or whether it's about moisture management, how we deal with the wood in temporary and permanent conditions, how we address fire, acoustics, vibration, everything. And comes out the back of it, I've got a lovely thank you. And by the way, will you be our chairman? And drive TRADA. And I only resigned this year, more because I don't have time anymore. But I was their chairman for 8 years. And we went on to do many publications, a lot of which are replicated around the world. Mass timber handbooks, how you're dealing with floor constructions, how you're dealing with moisture, how you're dealing with connection, robust details. And that, in a sense, probably got me into a little bit more trouble, because then I started getting invites to go around the world and do lots of speeches of a subject that I'm very passionate about. And I would never, when I do speeches, I don't sell myself. I don't sell the brand I'm attached to. I just show everybody my life experience and say, this is what can be done. And that kind of stimulates people's thought process. And it got me to every single continent, with the exception of Africa and Latin America. But it got me around the world. And then I got in some real hot water. Then the job offers start following, whether it's a Katerra in the US or it's the Building Construction Authority in Singapore, opportunities in Australia. And that I felt, I've kind of sort of turned myself into a bit of a lay preacher of going around the world and putting together ecosystems that sort of satisfy the market. And it's very much about listening to the market. Everybody thinks what we've done in our careers and our life experiences is innovative. It's not actually innovative. What you're doing is you're listening to what the market wants and you're giving it back to the market packaged up.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good segue here to kind of this other vocabulary word that I learned. Was visiting the website for Mercer Mass Timber.com. And you have some just amazing photos. And when we were talking originally, I said, there's a few of those where I said, that's what I want. I want to work in there. I want to be around the wood. I want natural light. I want that. And you're like, yes, the noun is biophilia. The adjective is biophilic. And I said, what? What are you talking about? So tell us, you mentioned that word and I didn't want to cut you off as you were rolling there. So biophilia, biophilic, what is that?
Biophilia is the human connection with nature. The impact of biophilia comes out through how we culture our design and the impact biophilia has on design. Therefore, the word biophilic comes out. And this is how we interpret and incorporate our connection with nature in the structure and the fabric of the building, if you like. Just thank you for taking the time to look at the Mercer website. Mercer are an amazing business. Mercer International, as you know, they acquired the facility in Spokane, and they're doing it right. They're doing it the right way. They're focusing more true to their core business strengths, which is taking biomass into bioproduct. Now, Mercer is predominantly on pulp, very large sawmillers in Germany and pretty much spanning across the globe, Canada, US, Germany and Australia. And the natural step change for those guys was to go into mass timber. And this is why I did a lot of work before I joined them. We talked about their appetite for risk. You're going into the construction industry, equally at the same time, what their core values were. And, you know, it's very much an industrial trade company that's in it for the long game. And they recognize that, you know, this is a growth market. And when we look at markets in Europe, CLT has been the disruptor. That has changed the dynamic. Glulam has been kicking around successfully since the 1950s. It's nothing new, but it kind of, Glulam's swept in the vortex of CLT. And when we look at Europe as a marketplace, that's been growing strong, you know, 20% growth, steady into 10% growth year on year over the last 25 years. You know, if we look at the North American market, that's kind of kicked in and people recognized it from around 2016.
Okay.
So a very young market here in North America.
Can I ask you, what exactly was it about CLT, cross-laminated timber, that was such a disrupting force?
Because it was mass. It was a true... So glulam is a direct replacement for steelwork. It cannot achieve certain spans or heights. It can't be a 60-story tower in glulam. Structural steel has it. Everything has its place. Where CLT came into the impact was the fact, hang on a second, we've got a component here that replaces precast concrete floors, precast concrete walls, metal deck and concrete. You know, I'm not advocating that concrete's a bad thing, but we can certainly limit the use of concrete in a structure. Everything has got its place. You still need concrete in the civils, in the ground, in the foundation, in the parquets. And then when you're building off it, well, then we can deal with it differently. Then we can look at alternative means of construction. And I think, you know, such beautiful projects around the world. Take Google headquarters in London, which I was involved with the designs back in 2017. It's just about complete now. That's a really good use of concrete in the ground, a big structural steel frame, concrete cores for key shear walls. But then the floor plates and some of the walls are all in CLT. You've got a really good mixture of the right material in the right place.
Okay.
And that's what it's about. And of course, you're taking the beautiful benefits of CLT because it's such mass timber, which is what is timber. It's made of sunlight, water, and carbon out the atmosphere. So carbon is sequestrated into the mass of the wood, which provides a true carbon offset against the other high intensified carbon components for, say, steel and concrete. Mm-hmm. So that's why CLT is such a game changer, because it is the true mass in mass timber.
Let's transition there. I'm probably guilty of this as well. I see just when we start talking about carbon, we start talking about sustainability, I come back to something that you just had said earlier, and you articulated really well when we were talking earlier about, at the end of the day, the economics of the project, the economics of, you know, the larger construction world environment we're living in, clients' capacity for risk, timelines, all of that comes into play. And you're talking about listening to the market. Tell us about this journey you've been on and maybe the overarching story that comes about mass timber coming to the United States, like a lot of things in construction, people say, we've been doing this in Europe for decades. It's just kind of new here. What's different? What's the same? And maybe tell us about the trends and what you see with mass timber here in the United States. And let's more broadly, I know you're in Vancouver, BC right now. Let's say North America. What do you see as those trends and maybe those opportunities?
There's two other parallels that have happened over the last 2 decades that have disrupted the construction industry. One is BIM, building information modeling. Without BIM, we couldn't model complex structures. We couldn't handle multi-materials or prefabricated components. States like steel and mass timber, they form part of the model now. Historically, buildings have migrated to concrete, the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, because it's a material that can be adapted on site quite rapidly. So what we're seeing over the last 2 decades is this bigger push towards prefabricated components. So if you put mass timber in the middle of the sandwich and you take the 2 outer layers, you've got BIM, the transition to the 3D world, and you've got the offsite journey as well.
Yes.
Offsite is here to stay. People or companies are looking at ways of, especially investors and developers, they want to realize their assets sooner and quicker. If they can knock 20-25% out of the construction schedule, not only are they saving on the GC's prelims, using a lightweight material, they can significantly reduce other costs like the foundation design. They're 2 obvious ones. If they can knock 25% out of the construction schedule, they're going to realize that asset sooner and start yielding quicker as well. So that's really a real good developer story. From a GC perspective, I'm starting to see a huge change in behavior, especially here in North America, where you've got historically concrete projects, lots of people on a construction site, very intensive, a higher probability and degree of risk associated with health and safety. Well, if you're starting to go for prefabricated components like mass timber, you are effectively just using a lot less bodies on the job site, which is far more efficient, which reduces the impact of health and safety, which is great, and it's just quicker. So it's kind of running in so many parallels now. So you've got BIM and you've got the world of offsite, and that's what really the accelerant is for mass timber, because it forms in that prefabricated space. And that's why North America might be lagging Europe in terms of the number of projects and the manufacturing base. But what North America is very good at is its adoption to changing technology and changing behavior as to where we build our buildings, for sure. And I am seeing that and dealing with a developer in California, a contractor. They've got a building and it was beautiful. It was 21 stories, steel frame, CLT floors, prefabricated wall components. And I asked, why did you pick that route? And they said, because it's just quicker and it's safer. And our client gets his building sooner. You kind of think, okay, the penny's dropping now. The world is changing. The behaviors are changing now.
I'm glad you brought that up, because when I've learned a lot from you and have been doing more research to get mildly educated on this, as I've been talking to folks about this, are they seeing this? What do they know? I feel like the lowest common denominator is for folks to immediately go not to a hybrid model. It's the pure mass timber. And they'll say, well, Hartman, you got to remember the constraints. If you're going to do this, you can only go, Fill in those blanks for me a little bit. You've kind of talked about kind of the hybrid model, and right there, just kind of 21-story building. Are there other relevant constraints that are out there? And how do you kind of handle if those come up as an objection, Nick?
One thing has happened in the background is the change in the IBC codes. It's been huge. The change that no longer is a timber building going to be restricted to 6 stories. If you go 100% mass timber, you can now design it across the United States up to 18 stories.
Okay.
If you start putting the hybrid model in, well, then you can go unlimited in height. So in terms of dealing constraints, we already have a rule book in place called the IBC building codes. And everybody's incredibly pragmatic here and adopting it. And it's prescriptive and it works.
Okay. Yeah. I'm not used to all those adjectives going around code books, but I don't want to derail the conversation here. Keep going.
We know the rule book. I mean, in-house, what I did was very much put together within Mercer a European model, whereby brought in a lot of clever structural engineers, mass timber structural engineers, and we can offer guidance to the engineer of record and the architect of record and say, look, this is your building.
Mm-hmm.
Our job is to put the hand in the glove, the skeletal structure. We'll work with the EOR and we will support him or her in terms of defining the calculations for the structural design, in terms of the connection design. So we try and make their life a lot easier. And I think that's so important. You can't come to the market as a pure manufacturer without that skill set, without that. If you're not able to take the client's Revit model, and then we can translate that into the structural mass timber model and send it back for coordination. And I think the use of technology has really removed those barriers for sure.
Yeah, well, having adjacent conversations, not purely relevant to what we're talking about here, but there's been different models of offsite in residential. And one of them, Integra, was kind of described to me as like, here's the entire solution. Take it or leave it. Here's how this thing rolls. Versus what I think what you just described of more just the collaboration and working together and saying, hey, there's a whole spectrum here. There's pure mass timber. There's also pure concrete and steel, which you're familiar with. Let's talk about the design constraints. Let's talk about budgets. Let's talk about timing, what makes the most sense and what gets most people excited, both financially, but also, as human beings.
Yeah, it's a balance. It's a balance and it's got to be holistic. If you look at the Integra model, created by the late Jerry McCaughey, who sadly passed last week, and he was absolute character in our industry. I knew Jerry from when he was in Ireland, when he was the managing director of Sentry Homes, and he came over to North America as a pioneer in that space.
Absolutely.
The business model was great, but probably limited to the residential market.
Mm-hmm.
And, in an environment like the US, when you start creeping up interest rates, well, developers start pulling back. The residential model is always the first model to hit. And I'm sure that had some impact on that business. But Jerry, in the latter few years, was sort of head of a lot of the offsite institutions. And he was leaning more towards mass timber because he saw the versatility in terms of it replicated similar to Integra, but still based on the principles of flat pack. Because at the end of the day, flat pack is, when you're transporting, especially across North America, and you've got distance.
Yep.
And take the volumetric model. Volumetric models work if factory is very close to the job site, because you're effectively transporting fresh air. Now, mass timber can be used as the chassis of volumetric, depending on the height of the building. But when you've got to look at it, you look at the facilities across North America in mass timber and the geography in part. I mean, you look at us now, Mercer, we've got two facilities. We've got the Spokane facility and we've got the other facility in Conway and one here in BC. It's about being geographically positioned, ideally where we would like to be over the coming years is as demand grows, we will have more facilities, more regionalised and using the regional species. That way, then we can translate the sourcing of local materials, the proximity of the factory to the job site. All them factors come into account in terms of, reducing cost. Mm-hmm. That's what it's about.
Absolutely. Cool. I'm watching the time here, Nick. I'm a book nerd. There's a book that I bought. I have not read yet, but I've been staring at it, thinking of you, thinking of this conversation. This is going to be the kick in the rear end to go. It's a book. Apparently it's by Roland Enos. It's called The Age of Wood. And it's kind of the history of wood with human beings in building. It was one of these books. I was super excited. I bought it and it's been sitting around for 9 months. But do you have any recommendations, whether it's a book, whether it's a website, whether it's whatever, where people can go to get educated on mass timber in general, and then maybe just tell us more specifically where they can connect with you or Mercer Mass Timber or anything else?
I'd say geographically here in the US, I would say Woodworks. I think Woodworks website is a real font of knowledge. There's so many great papers written about the do's and don'ts. Yeah, it's all about having knowledge available that's freely available in the public domain, which is what we did at Trada, and what Woodworks are doing here is amazing, because there's not just the knowledge there, there's comes up to the supply chain, and they themselves have structural engineers to give guidance as well. So they're a bit more than just a book. They're like a 3D book. They're a bit more of a working book. And I would really say, look at woodworks, but in terms of being impartial as well, for sure. But gosh, there's so many publications out there. And I think what we all recognize in the global mass timber world is we need to bring all that together in one place. So one thing I do is I create strong links from across the pond, not just in the UK, but within Europe. And that brings the power friends in Australia as well and New Zealand. I mean, they're huge protagonists when it comes to the mass timber space, so the Australians and New Zealanders. It's not about having one-off projects. It's about having sustainable markets. And spot markets become sustainable markets. And without a shadow of a doubt, and I say North America, Canada and the US, will be a bigger market than Europe over the next 20 years. Even though the population may be 1/3 by the demographics, it will be a bigger market because Europe is 28 countries, incredibly fragmented with all different building codes and obstacles. Whereas we're level playing field here. And it's a natural resource as well. And we've got the population here, we've got the facilities. If there's every time to be mass timber, North America is the place to be right now.
Awesome. Well, it's exciting. I think this is a great place to end, Nick. If people want to reach out to you to learn more, have you speak at their events, or just use you as a resource, obviously just a real fountain of knowledge and a proponent just for not only the history, but also I think the future of it, where would you recommend people reach out to you directly?
Oh, crikey. I'm on LinkedIn. Just catch me on LinkedIn, send me a message. Email address, easy, nick.milestone@mercerint.com. There's an easy one. But, I know we're coming to the closure, and I really want to close out where I actually started, back to my
Please.
granddad and his bag of tools. I'm determined before I leave this planet, I had to leave a legacy to transcend that knowledge. Not just my knowledge, but the knowledge that I'm creating with the generations to come. Because at the end of the day, if we don't leave sustainable legacies, then we're not doing right by our own species. And yeah, do we want to make a change and a difference to the world? Absolutely. We know climate change is real. Now I think everybody accepts that. We're seeing that in the turmoil in our weather conditions. And can we regress it? Well, we can certainly slow down the use of high carbon intensive materials with alternative substitutes. And then you look at the fundamentals of, say, wood versus steel versus concrete. Well, concrete and steel, they're taken out of the earth and never replaced. Steel is recycled, which is great, but still has a high carbon intensive amount just to recycle the steel. Whereas wood is actually grown for construction. And, when you've got an abundance of forests that are replaced from legal and sustainable sources, then, we're doing something right by the planet.
Yeah, that's a great bookend. I'm glad you did that. And Nick Milestone, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Bradley.
All right, then, friends, how did that go? Hopefully you enjoyed my conversation with Mr. Nick Milestone. He absolutely sped up my understanding and knowledge about the mass timber industry. And I'm fascinated to see the speed of adoption of new projects that really incorporate, whether it's kind of a full mass timber or a hybrid model, to get more wood out there on larger construction projects. If you did get value from my conversation, I'm going to ask two small favors. Number one, whatever podcast player you are listening to, please rate and review us. That means more to us than you know, as we strive to grow our audience and bring our construction community globally closer together. The other part is for folks that don't listen to podcasts or don't really understand where to find them, or maybe have looked into podcasts and just have seen there's a million of them and what to listen to, rating and reviewing won't really solve that problem. If you are listening to this now, odds are you are a leader in our community. Don't hesitate just to send a link out. Tell people to give this a shot. Pick a favorite episode. Maybe it's this one with Nick and say, just listen to this. And if it resonates with them, I think folks that have been resistant for whatever reason to podcasts and aren't using this as a platform to personally develop, which is by far what I've been able to do, not only guests like Nick, but also the other, 12 to 15 podcasts that I follow regularly. That is my most immediate source of being more knowledgeable and hopefully improving what we do here on this podcast. So if you get value from this, Sometimes it just takes grabbing their phone and saying, all right, we have to search. Yep, you already have a podcast player. It's called iTunes. Here you go. Subscribe to these couple and get them going. Take that extra step. Not only will you be doing me and my team a small favor, but you're going to be delivering value and helping them speed their own development. So those are the two requests there. Also, we're putting videos of my conversations with our guests out on YouTube. Why? We want to make this easier to share. And some of these insights that come out from people like Nick Milestone are really helpful and more impactful when we can actually see the video and hear them talking about the stuff. And on many of them, we are also using our partners who handle our graphic design, and they're layering graphics to tell better stories, to communicate better, to hopefully make us all more knowledgeable. So if you are not subscribed to our YouTube channel, go to YouTube and then look for Bradley Hartman & Co. Subscribe, and we'll go from there. All right, I'm done. That's all I got. We're going to close out like we always do with our leadership mantra. You, my friend, are owed nothing. Deliver value first. Make it a great week.